Hey everybody, welcome to week 11. We almost had the other cat guest lecturer there for a second. I don't know if you guys have even seen her, fluffy gray cat. Exciting, it may happen. She's lurking in the boundaries around us. But let's talk about actual politics. So this week, week 11, we're making some great progress in the course. We just wrapped up our third section covering, well, our history and our expansion of civil rights and civil liberties alongside political processes regarding parties and campaigns. But now we're going to start diving into more of the hands-on experiences of citizens. We're going to dive into the democracy, its applied practices, and some of the institutions over the next few weeks that we engage with when we engage in politics. And then we'll wrap up the course with a deep dive in U.S. foreign policy, as every single traditional government course does. So it's a fun section of the course. This is where we talk a lot about how we're going to impact government if we have the interest in doing so. If we engage with this material better, we'll be stronger citizens. So let's gain some strength. All right, what are we learning today? This week's lecture is more fun, I guess you could say. It's a lot of the topics that when I started diving into political science, these were the hot topics around representation. That's why that title is what it is for the week, although it's faded in relevance and then picked relevance back up in recent months. So this is an exciting time to be discussing the topics we're covering in today's lecture, which are electoral processes, why we vote the way we vote, electoral processes in the mind of the party and the electorate. Remember, the voters. In the mind of us, from our lens, we're going to look at two mechanisms at play regarding the voting process, and that is gerrymandering, regarding the redistricting of among single member districts, in addition to felony disenfranchisement, one's loss of the right to vote under certain circumstances revolving around a conviction of a felony sentence. So let's do a deep dive. And before we start on gerrymandering and felony disenfranchisement, I just want to talk briefly about the electorate and our experiences and why we have the incentive structures we do. So one of the electoral systems we didn't adequately cover in the past because, well, it's not present in the United States, but I do think it's beneficial to build our strength and ability to think critically about these processes, and that is the concept of proportional representation. This is where we have a distribution of seats in an elected body based on the portion of the vote that party obtained. Now, we have two dimensions of proportional representation. We have electoral processes where voters get to vote for their political parties. And even if only 5% of the population voted for that political party, 5% of representation within the legislative body will be granted to that political party. Now, some elections with proportional representation don't allow individual candidate elections, while some do. Some just allow individual citizens to vote for their party preference. Some allow for the party preference in addition to a side ballot where you measure in various different ways of determining this, but you vote for the candidates who represent that party. So say you obtain 15% representation for your party, well, that looks like 5 representatives from your party representing the legislature. Well, the top 5 vote getters within your party on that side election would represent the party in the legislature. So it's a system that is present in a lot of European states, a lot of other Western democracies. Think of a lot of Europe, but Israel, Germany, Switzerland, and many other states revolving around that region of the world, and Latin America as well, as proportional representation seems as the other approach to the systems we have in the United States. And it is widely productive. And it addresses and minimizes the impact of some of the aspects, predominantly gerrymandering, which we'll cover today, which is a byproduct of single member districts. Remember that term. So let's keep talking about voters. So when we look at the voters, the individuals among the general population, political scientists have been able to narrow down our incentive structures along 3 clear lines. When we cast our ballot, we cast our ballot for 1 or 2 or all 3 of these dominating reasons. First is our party loyalties. Studies indicate that roughly 80% of Americans maintain the same party identification that they established in their early 20s throughout the entirety of their lives. Oftentimes, young individuals, we know this from anecdotal evidence, we either create our party loyalties and party identification in response to following along with our parents' sentiments or in pushback to our parents' sentiments. And that response and that party affiliation we create in our youth and of course maintain over those first few electoral processes, not just our perspectives when we're 18, but our perspectives throughout our 20s, solidifies and is maintained with our party loyalty throughout among 80% of the general population. Now, what about that other 20% that might differ based on elections? How do those individuals vote when they have an opportunity to change their affiliation in an upcoming election? Well, they take one or two approaches. They either focus on the issues involved or they focus on the candidate characteristics. Let's start with issues involved. We see this in recent years. We've seen this in response to 2022 and some Supreme Court rulings focusing on women's reproductive rights. It became a notable spatial issue in the United States. But I also said a term there, spatial issue. What is the difference between a spatial issue and a valence issue? Well, spatial issues, think of it like women's reproductive rights, minimum wage. They're policies that offer a wide range of possible positions. And we often see those positions represented in each nuanced state. You see minimum wage in certain states like Virginia being $7.25 when I was younger. That was a blast to work minimum wage when I was in high school. And then we also see that minimum wage expanding to be upwards of $15 in some states like Washington. I believe it's around $9 here. Glad that I'm not too focused on current minimum wage in the state of Montana. Doing good in life. And we all have to get paid minimum wage at some point in our careers. It's just that stepping stone. So spatial issues, minimum wage is a great example of that. What is our starting point within the labor market? Also, women's reproductive rights. We see nuances in each state's policy positions on that issue. The spatial issue, summarized, is an issue that allows each state to have a nuanced and unique policy position. They have a range of options existing on a single spectrum. Now, valence issue, this is slightly different. This is where all voters will prefer a higher value or lower value depending on the metric. Think of unemployment. We all want lower unemployment. We all want more honesty of representations. We all want more access to government. And in many dimensions, we all want more liberty. So we see these two dimensions of issues that indicate, that provide a clarity on a specific divide revolving around what type of issues are present in an election. And we often see the classic examples of women's reproductive rights, minimum wage, and a lot of times honesty of representatives. We see people mobilized by these issues particularly. Now, if you were not mobilized by your previous party identification or the issues that our candidates are focusing on, or parties at large, or legislature is focusing on, you tend to gravitate towards candidate characteristics. There's a key term I want to address here, although it does not directly relate to candidate characteristics. It is a term incumbent. Incumbent, we briefly may have mentioned this in the past, but it is an important key term to be able to understand in politics. It is the representative who either currently or previously held the office they are running for re-election or election. So think of in the past election, the incumbent, if Joe Biden didn't step out of the race, was Joe Biden. We also see, Donald Trump was able to maintain some certain incumbent benefits, although he was not the most recent incumbent of the presidential office. But we do see in United States history, due in large part to gerrymandering practices, we'll look at that in a moment, that this results in significant incumbent benefits. So throughout U.S. history, we've seen, especially since the 1950s, 60s, incumbent has a high likelihood of winning re-election when they are running for re-election. While in recent years, political scientists have actually re-examined this concept, and some are arguing that there's an incumbent downside, as we have seen shifts in the way we obtain political information that has resulted in some wide range of negative information-based sentiments. But we do see either voting for or against candidates. We are often mobilized by candidate characteristics. Incumbent being an aspect of that gains a benefit for certain candidates in certain circumstances, but we also see through just thinking about anecdotal evidence revolving around Donald Trump and a good example of Bernie Sanders. Sometimes candidates can be so unique, just like how third-party candidates can reveal shifts in political party landscapes, and not just third-party, but unique candidates. Unique candidates can also reveal why we vote the way we vote, mobilizing shifts in political landscapes. So candidate characteristics, whether it's the unique sentiments of a candidate like Donald Trump representing a business mindset coming from a different dimension of our markets and our general population than past candidates, representing a unique appeal to certain individuals, or say the Bernie Sanders calling for the 99% against the 1%, calling for redistributive policies that benefit the middle classes. We see those different unique candidate characteristics oftentimes being the reason why many individuals within the United States mobilize and cast their ballots for either one of these candidates. And that, of course, is, let me remind you, if they are not prioritizing on the issues involved and maintaining their past party loyalties. Now, when we talk about the representatives we elect, it's important to make a clear distinction. And the citation for this I will provide in Eagle Online, although it is a more complex graduate level reading. It'll be marked as an optional reading and not required this week. But in this reading, we see a divide between how we can theoretically understand different electoral acts and the different ways that our elected representatives will govern once we elect them. We will either see delegate representation or trustee representation. So what are the differences here? Well, delegate representation simply states that when we elect representatives to do what when we elect representatives, we elect them to do what the majority of their constituents believe is best. Think of this as populism. They will do what the population is focusing on and prioritizing. Now, in contrast to this, we do see trustee representation within the U.S. and all representative democracies in the world. And trustee representation, in contrast, is when we elect representatives who use their personal experiences and intellect to determine what they believe is in the best interests of their constituents. A great example would be in some rural populations within the United States. They actually receive welfare. They actually have a large number of welfare recipients. But we also see among these collectives that a large percentage of those regions have negative sentiments regarding welfare practices. Well, a delegate representative would go into office, and regardless of what the percentage of their constituents are that utilize these welfare practices, if the general population, the majority, has a sentiment against them, they will implement legislation that overrules this distribution and results in no welfare distribution among that population. While a trustee representative may acknowledge that although the majority of the population has a sentiment of disdain for this kind of policy, we do see that a large percent of the population also relies on this policy, and it is in the best interest of the general population's economic welfare to maintain welfare distribution policies in that region. That is a single example of the different approaches we can see a delegate or a trustee representative making, but we simply understand a delegate determines their legislative actions based on what the people want them to do, and a trustee representative determines their legislative actions on what they believe the people need to be able to have liberty and security. So we see neither of these is better than the other. These are just two different theoretical levels of difference. We see that some very rationally want their representatives to do what they call for, while others very rationally elect individuals with certain intellect to do what those individuals believe is best for them. So when you think about who you're electing in office, think about all the reasons why you're electing them, your party loyalties, the issues involved, the candidate characteristics, but also ask yourself, am I electing a delegate or a trustee? And to what degree do I want a delegate or a trustee representative acting in my will? Now, when we talk about representation at large, there are some general concepts we need to understand. And this one, well, it's a bit quantitative, a bit numbers driven, but we do have to acknowledge two key dimensions of the American electoral process. And that is the ratio of citizens per elected representatives and the competition among the races for those elected representatives. So let's break these up one at a time. First off, let's address lack of competition. That's the first cluster there in the bullet points. At our current status, remember the House of Representatives, 435 elected bodies, elected seats that govern and operate our legislative branch. Well, among these 435 elections that happen every 2 years, we see that 16% of them maintain a true competitive chance for either party to win. In 84% of United States House of Representative elections, once the primary election has occurred, it is predictable at an almost 99% rate who the winner of the election will be based off of gerrymandering impacts, distribution naturally among the electorate, as Democrats tend to gravitate towards cities, Republicans rural areas. So we see our natural tendency to divide alongside gerrymandering influences as individuals have redrawn single member districts. We have a result of having 16% of our federal House elections resulting the will of a shifting population within the United States. Well, 84% of House elections are nearly always guaranteed to have a predictable result and are referred to as safe seats. So, have we always been like this? Well, not necessarily. Remember, 16% of current House elections are competitive. Before 1970s, the averages tended to be around 30 to 40% of our House elections were competitive. Of course, we will always acknowledge that the House representative running for, say, the most concentrated neighborhoods in Los Angeles will almost definitely be a Democrat and will represent a safe seat. And we can also acknowledge that a lot of the districts in deep rural Montana will almost always be Republican unless something significant shifts among the electorate. That's how those elections will go, and they will be referred to as safe seats. But there is an extent to which safe seats is something we do not want to constantly encourage and just allow to exist in the United States, as the level of safe seats dilutes our electoral ability and influence among our national government. So when you think about who you're electing, for one, ask yourself, why are you voting? Party loyalties, issues involved, candidate characteristics. Are they going to be a delegate or a trustee? And once the election results come in, well, before the election results come in, is it predictable whether this is a competitive or safe seat? And how many competitive races are you voting in as an U.S. citizen? Now, to continue moving on, as we can't talk about lack of competition in U.S. federal House elections forever, let's acknowledge district ratios. Now, remember, our House of Representatives has 435 seats because it is based off our population. We have one House representative for every said number of U.S. citizens. But in 1910, we stopped increasing the number of House seats. I'll explain that in just a moment. But we do know that currently our national average is that we have 761,000 citizens per every single U.S. House representative. That means every single House representative has to consider the interests of 761,000 individuals. And that number may vary significantly by state. When you look at the state of Delaware, the state with the most constituents per representative, they have almost 1 million individuals, all representing themselves through one House representative. While we have the opposite side of the spectrum, Wyoming, that has one representative for every 100,000 individuals. This is very important because this is how you determine the power. This is how you can quantify the power of your vote. How much influence do you have as a voter? Well, if you live in Delaware, you have significantly less influence than if you lived in the state of Wyoming. As individuals in the state of Wyoming, although they may have state governments and House representative seats that are quite predictable and not competitive, they do represent some of the most influential voters, as every House representative only has to consider the interests of 580,000 compared to almost 1 million, resulting in more value per vote. Think of it simply this way. If you were trying to win an election in the state of Wyoming and compared to the state of Delaware, you would literally have to get less supporters than in the state of Delaware, resulting in more influence per vote. So, you're that individual trying to win an election, you knock on a door and they say, you got my vote. Well, they just increased your chance of winning, notably more of a percentage than if you were in the state of Delaware. Now, why do we have this system? Well, we remember the compromises made at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, but we also remember that this is an issue that was addressed and capped at 1910. So why did we have this cap? We'll look at that in just a moment, but we also have to remember what the starting point was. That is James Madison's original proposal at that Constitutional Convention. which he later developed and wrote in more detail in his Federalist Papers during the time period of negotiation and debates regarding what our Constitution will state. As remember, that's what the Federalist Papers were intended for. So when addressing the issue of how many citizens per representative, James Madison made a constitutional amendment proposal which did not result in implementation, but garnered some support and represents his general sentiment that in this amendment, he called for one representative for every 30,000 to 50,000 citizens. And anything beyond 50,000 would be a dilution of the influence of the voter that exceeds a democratic system. So even the Federalists at the time, fearful of excessive mob rule, were focusing on the fact that we cannot have too many citizens per representative. And we even see a representative quote of James Madison's in Federalist Paper number 55 as he states, quote, "In general, it may be remarked on this subject that no political problem is less susceptible of a precise solution," explaining, basically stating we cannot have an exact answer that applies to every single scenario, to continue, quote, "than that which relates to the number most convenient for a representative legislature. The ratio between the representatives and the people ought not to be the same where the latter are very numerous as where they are very few," basically stating that we cannot have too many citizens per each representative. And this call was dismissed for many of years. Was maintained a focus for many years, resulting in its eventual dismissal in 1910 in the new system that we've implemented. So let's talk about that time period, around 1910. 1910 was the last time we expanded the number of seats in our House of Representatives. This was later supported about 20 years later in 1929 through the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929, which simply stated that this legislative action capped the number of House of Representative seats. So from 1790 until 1910, we did see steady increases in the number of representatives in the House of Representatives. That started from 65 and originally capped at 435, although we had a brief period where we hit 437 in the 50s and 60s. Talk about that in just a moment. But we see in 1910, we determined that we had a continuously growing population. But the more seats we implemented in the House of Representatives, the more we diluted the power of each of these representatives. And the more we created a crowded body of governance. And we need to maintain a level of efficiency. Remember, the House and the Senate, the differences, one of the key differences is the level of hierarchy that is present in the House of Representatives, which is essential for the effectiveness of the body that has so many representatives. So we noticed this flaw. We also saw significant demographic shifts at the time. Rural areas lost huge numbers of their populations as due to industrialization, we see concentrations of individuals within cities. That resulted in shifts among the representation between states that we're deeming to be challenging. So for the first time in 1910, due to these demographic shifts in rural and urban areas, not Democratic or liberal, but rural and urban, we see the cap on the amount of representatives, 435 to be maintained for all of US history, with brief moments of vulnerability. So let's look at this legislation. Of course, we know that the primary impact is that it capped the number of representatives in the House of Representatives at 435, and we had a brief moment when we added the states of Hawaii and Alaska in the years 1959 and 1963, where we extended this each time briefly to 437 with a 2 elected representative increase. We also see other electoral impacts from including the states of Hawaii and Alaska. There's a classic example of Hawaii. There was a sentiment, and of course this is the 1950s, right before the significant party realignment, so the political parties were not what we envision them to be today, but Hawaii was predicted to be a Republican stronghold state. And that is one of the many reasons why we expanded statehood to the region of Hawaii, providing them more legislative power. It was supported by that party at that time, although we saw shifts in Hawaii's demographics, resulting in them in recent years being a Democratic stronghold. So when we see the implementation of new states or expanding voting rights, a lot of times the incentives to or not to provide those voting rights shift with each coming decades. So just a fascinating little rant there as we talked about, as we acknowledged the moment when Hawaii and Alaska became states in 1959 for Hawaii and 63 for Alaska. So we also remember a big part of this act that capped it at 435 also acknowledged that we will re-examine distribution of House seats, but we will do this in a new structure. Every census year, every 10 years, basically, every even numbered, 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940, 50, 60, 2020, 2010, 20,000, 20,000, 2,000, that's the right way to put it. Each of those years, we will have a census in which we measure the distribution of our population, and then we will account for that data in our House of Representatives, sometimes moving House of Representative seats. A great example of that is in 2020, the 2020 census that resulted in Montana gaining a House Representative seat and California losing one. We took their Cali, maybe a little too much because we didn't want their Cali in our Cali, but we accept some Cali when we get more voting rights. And it's fascinating when you look at the state that had the most constituents per House Representative before 2020, it was Montana. And then we were replaced by Delaware because, we gained more voting power as individuals. Yeah. So we remember that period as one of the anecdotal periods of evidence in which we can see this process in effect. So every 10 years, we will reevaluate our distribution based off of our census and oftentimes redraw district maps within our single member districts. And that is where the issue of gerrymandering comes up. Now, before we dive into gerrymandering, I want to provide a little quote from the legislation. The Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929 does state, quote, "The number of representatives shall hereafter be 435, beginning with the 83rd Congress and thereafter." We're somewhere in like 100 and some teens Congress. The apportionment of representatives shall be made by the method now known as the method of equal proportions, end quote. And that method of equal proportions is the process in which we re-examine the distribution of our 435 House seats every census year. Sorry if you could hear that, and that was overwhelming my commentary. They like to drive loud cars in front of my street because I live near downtown Kalispell. So let's talk about gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the manipulation of an electoral constituency's boundaries as to favor one party or class. What enables us in the United States to have gerrymandering as a practice? It is the existence and persistence of our single-member districts, the opposite of proportional representation. Single-member districts, as we already know from the past lectures, is where we divide the state into multiple districts, and in each of these districts we have one representative who speaks for all of the individuals in that population, that geographically defined population. So we do see when we look at that apportionment process in which we determine the distribution of House seats every census year, it is a responsibility of the party in the majority to redraw these district maps. Some state legislatures can redraw districts at any time. If we are in a point of district conflict, I guess you could say, we are currently in one of those periods, as this week's reading does address the current status of gerrymandering and redistricting during a non-census year, as it is a focal point in contemporary discussions and debates revolving around the states of Texas, California, and Missouri, with other states having reactionary measures in recent weeks. And we will try and predominantly focus on those three states and the developments in them as they happened a few months ago, which allows us some time for analysis. So the week's reading dives into those three examples, although we do see more contemporary building up and redrawing of district maps. As I said, there are some issues that we're covering this week that faded in relevance for a brief period and are building back up as we have seen the topic of gerrymandering a focal point in contemporary discussions. So again, let's bounce back. Single-member districts enables gerrymandering to occur because we are dividing the state into multiple districts with one representative. And that means when you have one representative, they will never, in a pluralist democratic system, represent 100% of the population when it comes to the votes they garnered. but they will then, in the actions of their new elected office, will have to represent the interests of 100% of their district, which is a result that reveals that we have significant percentages of our populations within single member districts who did not vote for their current representative and do not believe their current representative perfectly represents their interests. So those minority populations within single member districts are oftentimes underrepresented. And it is the way we draw these districts that can determine who those minority representatives are. And sometimes those minorities within each single member district may even be a majority in the state. So what do I mean by that? So when we look at gerrymandering, there are two dimensions of gerrymandering that we've seen dominating in contemporary and historical trends. That is partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering. Partisan gerrymandering, partisanship. It's when you try and benefit one political party over another. We know from past election cycles that this neighborhood votes 90% in favor of one party, while this neighborhood votes 90% in favor of the opposite party. Well, if we determine our single member districts with that in mind, we might be able to make one party with equal representation now a minority within multiple districts. I'll tell you about the process of that and the tools and mechanisms at play in just a few slides. But we also see the most historical and examined within our courts form of gerrymandering, and that is racial gerrymandering, in which we dilute or concentrate minority voting powers, either race, gender, sex, whatever it may be. We dilute the influence of those individuals by either concentrating them in one district when there are possibly 50 districts, or distributing them as a minority in all 50 districts. Now, let's look at how gerrymandering occurs. We know from this slide, our key takeaway is that we cannot have gerrymandering if we do not have single member districts. And we have single member districts, which are the division of states into multiple small districts with single representatives speaking for each. And gerrymandering plays a significant role when you look at the lines of those districts. Now, we also have to acknowledge, before we go into the mechanisms of gerrymandering, how we have a tendency to naturally gerrymander ourselves, natural distribution of the electorate. So this is where partisans are divided in the US geographically. Democrats have a tendency to move into cities, urban areas, and Republicans have a tendency to distribute in rural areas. We see public opinion surveys that focus on this sentiment, and it's oftentimes a sentiment that Democrats want to live in areas, and this is a polling question that I identified in my graduate research. Democrats have a high tendency to prefer diverse in areas in which they experience frequent engagement with conflicting ideas. Republicans have a tendency to want to live in homogeneous areas that don't focus on diversity as much as they focus on individual liberty and the ability for you to have your own property and land. So when you look at an opinion, why would you move to a certain location? Democrats have a higher tendency to say, I want to move to this location because there is greater diversity and more engagement with conflicting ideas and more engagement with numerous cultures. While a Republican would say, I want to live in this area because I want to have my own property, my own land, something I can pass down future generations to my own children, and I want to live in a community with like-minded ideological beliefs, oftentimes represented through religious affiliation. So we see those different approaches, those different rational polling question tendencies among partisan minds. Well, this results in Democrats living in highly concentrated urban areas and Republicans distributing themselves among wide ranges of rural areas. The map we have in the top right corner is the best example. This is a map of a population that is divided nearly evenly down the lines, 50% Democrat, 50% Republican. If you were to identify one color, you can see there. That color would be red, and thanks to 2000 election, we identify that with the Republican Party. But it is worth noting, although we see so much more red, there is an equal distribution of voters in the image we are seeing. So, why is that the case? Well, it's for two reasons. Natural tendencies for us to move into either urban or rural areas along partisan lines, and second, single member districts. That even if you only have 50, sometimes if you have 3 candidates, only have 35% electoral support, you gain the influence of governing for that entire district. So we could see in many of those red districts, there are 40%, 30%, 49% Democratic voters. In a lot of those blue districts, you see 30, 40, 49% Republican voters as well. Now, this is, of course, we know that they don't have representation due to single member districts. And if you were more interested in the natural gerrymandering tendencies and just our tendencies to divide along rural and urban lines with partisan representation in the process, there's a great work that I read, and it was central to my thesis, The Politics of Resentment, Rural Consciousness in Wisconsin, written by Catherine Kramer. There's some audiobooks on it if you're like me. It's a great resource and a phenomenal dive into the state of Wisconsin in determining why people vote the way they do. And is it more influential to have a Democrat or a Republican, or more influential to have a like-minded rural mind or a like-minded urban mind? And she argues that a more influential driving factor in American politics is actually our urban and rural divide over our partisan divides, and they influence our partisan divides. A unique and niche argument among partisanship in the United States, but we do understand the influence it has when it comes to the reason behind it as it represents natural gerrymandering. Now, before we move on, what is the result of this distribution? We have to acknowledge that as we have many individuals concentrating within the Democratic Party in very small defined areas, there is less wiggle room, I guess you could say, for gerrymandering practices, as it is very difficult to cut out a building in a neighborhood of a certain downtown city compared to cutting out a neighborhood itself in a wide-ranging rural collective. Because remember, this is based on population numbers, not any geographical metric. So you have to make a single member geographically defined district that represents, say, 700,000 people. Well, it is very hard to make a unique district representing 700,000 people in a community that overlaps so heavily like a city, while rural areas have the ability to do that more easily as you're looking at neighborhoods instead of buildings that represent the equivalent of community numbers in population regards. So this has mobilized certain abilities for gerrymandering and restricted others within cities. Now, what mechanisms are at play when we look at the gerrymandering process? There are three things that one can do to, I guess you could say, gerrymander an election. It is cracking, packing, hijacking, and kidnapping. Hijacking, kidnapping, we're kind of putting that into one. So let's go one at a time. What is cracking? Cracking is when you divide voters of one's opposition across multiple districts with the purpose of diluting their influence. Say you have, I'm trying to think of how to do this without a whiteboard behind me, but let's think you have a neighborhood that is, you have a large population that is 50-50, 50 Democrat, 50% Democrat, 50% Republican. And on one side, there's a neighborhood that's 90% Democrat, and the other side 90% Republican. And a lot of that diversity is right there in the middle. Well, you could draw a district that, and you're drawing this geographically defined area into three unique districts. Well, you could have one district be Democratic, one Republican, and one a swing district. That could go either way. Or you could break up those Democratic or Republican populations and have them be diluted because they don't make up a majority of a district. So you could take that Democratic neighborhood and cut them in half and put them in a weird map with 50, with a majority of the Republican neighborhood. And you can do this in a way that enables you to know that 51% or 60% of the voting population all very predictably votes along one party line, which could result in a non-competitive race. So that was a bit confusing because I'm trying to say what I do on the whiteboard, but cracking is where you take a population and you split them up and you distribute them in multiple districts so that they have a diluted influence in the election of those districts. Somebody that could be 50% of a population, a mindset that could represent 50% of a voting population, now represents 10%. And no matter how respected and dominating that mindset is on the national level, if they're only 10% of the specific district, they have low influence. And you could even take a population in the United States using cracking practices that is 60%, and give them the electoral representation of somewhere along 40 or 30%. Now, packing is a mechanism that goes alongside cracking. So cracking, you divide the population to where there is a small percentage of the voting population within a single member district. Packing is where you take every voter from one political party or one race or one mindset, and you concentrate them in a single district, basically saying, we'll give you that election. We will give you that seat in representation, but we will make it to where everybody who has your views is in that one district. So you are less likely to win any other races, because we're looking at states here. Say a state has 20 seats and a certain part of the population represents 50% and they've historically gotten 10. Well, you can use packing and cracking practices to guarantee them 2 races, but ensure that they do not have the ability to influence any of the others, resulting in, although in a sense in those 2 districts you feel like you're giving them more power by giving all the voters their own district, you're also minimizing the amount they can influence the state at large and harm the percentage of the elected body in which can represent their interests. Now, what is hijacking and kidnapping? And so where you're redrawing a district to force an incumbent into a competitive race. Because remember, how many races in the United States are necessarily competitive? 16%. So if you have an individual who, maybe within your own party, who has maintained sentiments prioritizing more moderation or interests of the opposing party, you can redraw their district in a sense that makes their competition have a greater chance and take what was previously a safe seat and turn it into a competitive race. And that is the process of hijacking and kidnapping. So we see the mechanisms of gerrymandering being cracking the division of populations to then represent only small percentages of a single member district, packing, giving a population an almost near 100% representation within a district so they don't influence other districts, and hijacking and kidnapping, redrawing a district to change what was a safe seat into a competitive race. So let's look at some of the most heavily gerrymandered districts in the United States. We can see through examples like Maryland's 3rd district here in number 1, Illinois' 4th district, and Texas's 35th district, although they are all examples of highly gerrymandered districts, utilizing those mechanisms and practices we previously mentioned. But I also want to point out one other detail, because remember, these are geographically defined areas for one single member, so they have to be connected. You know, the Israel-Palestine conflict, they have the Gaza Strip and West Bank separated. Along American districting lines, that is not allowed. It has to be geographically connected. So that was a bit of an inflammatory example, but visualize it on a map if you have that level of engagement with that issue. It's a great example of map visualization, only geographic map visualization. So we know that in the United States, you have to have a geographically defined continuous location. So in Maryland, we see you can utilize those practices of cracking, packing, to make districts that have, say, all of one party here, and then we use a highway to connect it. See this narrow line right here? There is a high likelihood that there is not a single person living in that part of this district, because that is a highway or a river connecting two populations that are either like-minded if they are packing this district. Say this is a very 50-50 split geographic area. Well, imagine if everything you see here is, because that's not representing bodies of water and land, that's representing just the district. Imagine everything else. Well, this little geographically defined area, that's where all the Republicans live, or all the Democrats live. And if we take an area like this size, that's about this square size, that allows the election of, say, 4 representatives, then we take every Democrat and we put them in this one district. What was 50-50 is now guaranteed to be 1 Democratic representative and 3 Republican representatives. Or flip it, 1 Republican representative and 3 Democratic representatives for this one specific area. That if you allowed a natural districting in a natural election, you would see a 50-50 split with swing districts in almost every case. But this practice allows the party in power, to split or distribute those votes, or the collections likely to vote a certain way. As we can see, 80% of those voting based on party loyalties maintain that affiliation, so we are predictable beings when it comes to elections. We can see these tools utilized to make districts that benefit one party over the other. And these are real world examples of some of our most heavily gerrymandered districts, connected by highways and rivers and segments of the population that literally have no one living on them. But why are we using that as a part of a district? For one, so we can have electoral benefits to one collective over the other. But there's also reality that this means governance is a little harder, because not only is this, I don't know what exactly this is, whether it's a highway or a river, but you can imagine that those in this side of the highway, have slightly different, at least, interests than those on this side. Think of it like the representatives governing for Kalispell specifically compared to those governing for West Glacier and compared to those governing for Polson. Think about the one issue of water rights alone. They all three have a different interest. Now, what if, due to gerrymandering, we have the elected representative of Kalispell also governing and splitting up a lot of the population in Polson? And I know water rights, some of us may engage with this, some of us may not. We know Polson has influence, I believe, generally, very loosely, minimally. I don't engage with this too much. They influence water distribution into Flathead Lake. Flathead, we always want more, as our population, we always want more water in the lake. Polson wants to regulate that for environmental purposes, often considering other lakes and bodies of water. And we see a whole nother dimension of that same issue in West Glacier, as they have to consider the interests of the park, the environment in that region, and the Hungry Horse Dam. So one issue with those three very close communities has a wide range of policy preferences that we need to make sure are represented in government, so we don't have the interest of one community and their unique geographical needs dismissed. So this, alongside its representative impacts, we do see can sometimes result in challenges for representatives who govern these districts, who may have very different needs from this northern part of the district compared to the southern part, or this eastern compared to the western parts. So it challenges the task of governing for these individuals, as well as determines how the election may result, oftentimes resulting in a lack of competitive elections. And this practice itself has resulted in what we have today, where 16%, only 69 elected bodies within our House of Representatives, do we actually have a possible chance of either party winning. So let's talk about another issue: felony disenfranchisement. So what is felony disenfranchisement? Why are we talking about it immediately after gerrymandering? Well, felony disenfranchisement is a key aspect of our representation. For one, this has historical roots in that bounce off of our lecture from last week regarding the Reconstruction era and the Civil Rights era, Jim Crow legislation, and black codes. But also, it is influencing contemporary elections, as 1.7% of the current national voting population in the year of 2024 did not have voting rights due to the policies revolving around felony disenfranchisement. And we know, as citizens, 1.7% of the population can sway most presidential elections. So let's talk about felony disenfranchisement. What is it? Well, if you are convicted of a felony, depending on certain felony convictions and depending on your state, you may, for a certain period, lose your right to vote because you've been convicted of this felony. Now, many people on a theoretical level say, well, it is a part of punishing one for crimes. If you've convicted a felony, you know there's a punishment to that action, and this is one of them. Well, that's a very valid argument for many. There's also the other argument that when some people commit crimes, they do not think of losing the foundational right of their citizenship, which is their right to vote and influence politics. And maybe sometimes the extent of a certain crime should not equate to you losing your foundational aspects of citizenship. So those are the theoretical sides of each dimension of this debate. And in the United States, regardless of what side of the debate you stand on, we do have to acknowledge that there are 4 million, roughly 4 million Americans that currently do not have the right to vote because of the actions they've committed in their past, sometimes many, many years in their past, depending on the state laws. So we see this is an issue that, again, I say hot topics regarding representation because these were the issues that when I started focusing on politics in the year 2016, they were front and center. They were in your face as much as you could ever imagine. These were the issues that we, the people, are mad about and we need to solve. And there was almost a unanimous consensus for this. You saw bipartisan collectives, predominantly in the state of Florida, both Democrats and Republicans calling for the end of felony disenfranchisement legislation. And we see a lot of this legislation was heavily concentrated in the Southeast. So when we talk about this, we have to acknowledge the implementation process. This was implemented during the Reconstruction era. And we will look at it in just a moment, the validity it relies on obtaining from the 14th Amendment, but its origins in response to the Reconstruction era, in response to the 14th Amendment, which were also mobilized during the Jim Crow era and civil rights, alongside Jim Crow legislation in the civil rights era. So let's talk about that briefly. So what is the legitimization of felony disenfranchisement? So here we have three dimensions. My pinky was sneaking up there, of why this is legitimized in the United States. First, the 14th Amendment. The second, the Supreme Court's interpretation of that amendment. And third, the thing I put right in the middle there because it just, well, the structure, it looks better. Sorry, it bothers me sometimes, is its historical roots. So let's start by acknowledging the historical roots. Beyond our legal interpretation and validation of this legislative action, we do have to understand that in states, especially in the state of Alabama, we do see it wasn't relying on national legislation and national constitutional legitimacy. And it actually, we have some states, like in 1910, implemented this as a dimension of their constitutions. As the Alabama Constitution states, no person convicted of a felony or of any crime involving moral turpitude, that's a key aspect, shall be qualified to vote until restoration of civil and political rights. So we see some states focusing on the action of moral turpitude. Now, what is moral turpitude? Well, that's a crime that one believes warrants disenfranchisement. We see during the Reconstruction era a rise in people using the term disenfranchising offenses. Now, what do they mean by this at the time? At the time, they were focusing on crimes in which we were able to predominantly arrest that of the black population in the United States. These include theft, vagrancy, also known as homelessness. Remember, a key aspect of the black codes was that it made homelessness illegal. It made working in certain industries illegal. It made gun ownership illegal. It made near existence illegal for many black Americans of the South. And these disenfranchising offenses acted as a lot of the foundational legitimacy, relying on the use and implementation of black codes to disenfranchise millions of individuals in the South. Felony disenfranchisement was one of the main tools utilized within the southern states to restrict minority access to polls. So there's the moral turpitude and disenfranchising offenses legitimization that was present among the general population, predominantly in those southern states, during a period where there was an attempt to find any way to restrict the voting rights and influence of a newly enfranchised population. So, beyond theoretical legitimization we see present among our elected representatives, we also see two dimensions of constitutional legitimacy. The first is the 14th Amendment. We remember Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. I mentioned it and how it has an influence in interpretation in contemporary courts and was relied upon around the 2020 election for both upper and lower ballot candidates, as it states that the states have the right to abridge voting rights, quote, for participation in rebellion or other crimes, end quote. So we see the restriction in contemporary days as we have interpretations regarding participation in rebellion. What does it mean to participate in a rebellion? What is a rebellion? Would they consider the events of January 6, 2021 as a rebellion, or would they not? What extent do you quantify somebody as participating, and how much does that result in them not being able to run for office or being able to run for office? That's how we've seen it in contemporary days. But this text, historically, predominantly during the Reconstruction era, mobilized those to use that term or other crime to their advantage, relying on black codes representing those other crimes, the crimes being not working in agriculture, crimes being not being able to buy your own home, not being able to own a gun, and much more that restricted the rights of those African Americans of the South. But as all things within our Constitution, you need interpretation, and that's where our Supreme Court steps in and provided two pivotal cases interpreting predominantly the second section of the 14th Amendment. So we start in 1974 with Richardson versus Ramirez, and it's a simple conclusion we take from this case. This resulted in the exclusion of felons from the right to vote is an affirmative sanction in Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, stating if you have an originalist approach to interpreting our 14th Amendment, you see that it does state that we have the right to abridge voting rights for those who have committed other crime. So, what happens about 10 years later when we re-examine the influence of our 14th Amendment after a period of significantly heightened racial gerrymandering? Well, Hunter v. Underwood stated that felony disenfranchisement motivated by racial discrimination is unconstitutional, and this relied on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and that is where we see the overturning of the Alabama Constitution signed in 1901, actually not 1910, in which it was Article 8, Section 182, that no longer stands due to the Supreme Court ruling provided in Hunter v. Underwood. It is illegal to consider the metric of race when determining felony disenfranchisement laws. And these felony disenfranchisement laws have disproportionately harmed the population, the black population of the South. So we see the 70s, 80s was a period of heightened use of gerrymandering alongside felony disenfranchisement to limit the voting rights of a certain population in the United States, pushing back, because remember, all social movements will have a counter movement, pushing back against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, when we look at disenfranchisement, felony disenfranchisement in the United States, it's very important to know what these laws look like. So, and it's very important to also consider, since 2016, we have exponentially improved our standing regarding this issue in the eyes of many. Many states are dismantling felony disenfranchisement legislation or moving towards the upper ladder of these four levels of disenfranchisement in the United States. So let's talk about this. There are two states and Washington, D.C., that allow you to vote while still in prison, that never at any point in your criminal case or criminal proceedings will you lose the right to vote. And we will bring a ballot to you in your cell if we need to. In 23 states, voting is allowed after you are released from prison. If you have the capacity to get to a poll, you have the capacity to cast a ballot. The majority of states aligning with this sentiment. 15 states do begin restricting your right to vote while in the general population. They restrict your right to vote up until you have finished your parole and probation, often extensive periods that last years after your release from prison. And in 10 states, there is no voting access for the remainder of your life for certain felony violations. Now, it is worth noting, these laws have changed exponentially in the last decade in which I have been covering this content. 10 states do still have felony disenfranchisement exceeding that lasts for the remainder of your life for certain felony violations. In the state of Florida, for example, in the year 2019, they changed their felony disenfranchisement laws significantly. Florida was the state with the most heavily disenfranchised population in the United States. And they still have that number, actually. It is persisting to date. But we do see in the year 2019, they implemented legislation that changed their approach. Previously to 2019, any form of felony conviction resulted in you losing your right to vote for the rest of your life. There's actually a felony violation on the books in the state of Florida, which I always love mentioning as a more of a comical lens, break the ice, that if you are caught tampering with another individual's lobster trap, that is technically classified as a felony. Nobody's getting convicted of this felony, but it's technically on the books. Now, maybe another dimension of law utilized to restrict the rights of a certain collective. But we do see that after 2019, they changed felony disenfranchisement laws, restricting the amount of convictions that result in you losing the right to vote for the rest of your life. And now it is concentrated to sexual convictions, sexual felonies. But it is also worth noting that if you were individual who had a different felony violation that does not classify under a sexual offense, you still have to pay a fee under this new code, this new law, to reobtain your right to vote. And for many in the state, that fee was notably high enough to restrict them from being able to reobtain their voting rights. In addition, since 2019, with shifts in the electorate and partisan sentiments, we do see a refocusing on restricting the reenfranchisement of those previously disenfranchised individuals, and this fee to reobtain voting rights has increased, and it has been harder to access for many who still qualify for reobtaining their voting rights under the 2019 legislation. So we see this is a issue with nuanced enforcement in each state, with shifts responding to the general sentiments of the population. As in 2016 up until 2019, there was a heavy push calling against disenfranchisement legislation, which has, after gaining some traction around 2019, faded in focus and has enabled legislation to go into effect in the counter impact. We also want to know that, and we will see this in a slide in just a moment, disenfranchisement legislation, felony disenfranchisement, is what Barack Obama at John Lewis's eulogy stated is a remaining relic of the Jim Crow era legislation and the black codes of the Reconstruction era, as this legislation is predominantly focused on the southeastern states, highly influencing states with the largest percentage of the population being African American. And another detail that helps support this identification of a racial influence between this legislation and its impact is when you look at the states of Maine and Vermont, the two states without felony disenfranchisement legislation are the two quantifiably whitest states in this nation. As if you take 100 individuals at random, there is the highest likelihood that they will be majority of a single race, the race being white, in the states of Maine and Vermont. Greater rates, notably greater rates than in the state we live in currently, Montana. So that connection is clearly affiliated when you look at U.S. history and even contemporary felony disenfranchisement legislation. One point we have to remember from this slide: what is the felony disenfranchisement legislation presently in effect in the state of Montana? Well, it's the same legislation that was in effect in the state of Montana a decade ago. Your voting rights will be restored after you were released from prison. We stand in the majority alongside 22 other states, expanding voting access once you are released from prison. And we do acknowledge, as it stands today, states are reconsidering and altering disenfranchisement legislation every week, it seems. When I make this slide every semester, I have to make edits to this slide, edits to the details, the distribution of states. And I'm going to point out this next graphic here to wrap up discussions on felony disenfranchisement to illustrate how, well, this has shifted so much in recent years, but we are so close to what the map indicated just 10 years ago. Oh. So let's look at this map. A few key takeaways. One, this is as of the year 2015. So we see these states have shifted in their felony disenfranchisement laws. The map generally still looks like this, and a lot of the shifts we've seen, for example, in Florida, may lose the vote permanently, your right to vote for the remainder of your life. Well, there are far less individuals that, if convicted in the year 2025, will lose their right to vote permanently than if convicted in the year 2015. But there are still individuals losing their right to vote for the remainder of their life after a felony conviction in the state of Florida. Also, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arizona, Iowa, Wyoming, and also Delaware. Now, when we look at these states, we can see the concentration in the most harsh felony disenfranchisement legislation in the Southeast, the states representing the states implementing the most intense versions of Black Code legislation and Jim Crow legislation. This seems to be the perfect coattail off of civil rights and civil liberties. No matter how much time we designate to examining these issues, there are mechanisms at play that have more influence in our lives than we may acknowledge, including felony disenfranchisement, including gerrymandering, including the basic incentives of why we vote the way we vote, whether we're knowingly voting for delegates or trustees. These are the details that empower us to be better voters, to be stronger voters, more engaged, more able to represent our own interests, and know whether we prefer our delegates or our trustees to govern and implement systems that encourage or discourage gerrymandering practices or felony disenfranchisement. And we know in recent months, gerrymandering has become a focus and a hot point of debate and a tool utilized. We are not at a census year. There is no call to action to re-examine district lines, but we have numerous calls to action within states to re-examine district lines. And I am not calling out any single party over the other. Our reading clearly illustrates that this is an action taken by both political parties. Their incentives may differ, the start of the discussion may differ, but does it matter when the act provides the same result? These are questions to ask yourself. I do not have the answer, and I do not have your answer. So please engage with this content, learn deeply about it. Make sure you can answer these what did we learn slides, because this is the objective truth guiding it. This has no preference, opinion, or sentiments. This is the objective truth. And the better you understand this, the better you can empower your subjective beliefs and mobilize yourself in a system in which we have these restrictions. Here's some more what did we learn? What's due this week? We got one more assignment. The last assignment. I'm pretty sure we're almost done. It's a 3-2-1 analysis. The document walks you through it, but basically just identify themes, concepts, and questions revolving around whatever reading you choose this week. I will post multiple readings for you to have some opportunity to pick one over the other, but make sure you go through those readings. Make sure you complete the assignment. Make sure you do what you're just finishing up right now and take notes on this lecture. You contribute to the weekly discussion as we've been doing all semester, so that should be we'll be able to catch some rhythm with that. And communicate if you're realizing that you need some help with certain dimensions of this course. Check your grade. We're starting to get aspects of all of our grades coming in. Give me another week or so with the midterms. It takes me over an hour to grade each midterm because my goal is to take every sentence you wrote and give you guidance off of every single sentence. So that takes a lot of time. I have to reread things. I have to reevaluate, make sure my last comments make sense because I finished it all up. And I try and give you a little summary on how, to keep working on it. And I am also making myself available via Zoom to answer any questions you have about any of my comments. I can sit here on a 5-hour Zoom and walk you through the editing process if that's what you require to be able to adequately write this paper. I am here to help you. You just got to communicate your needs. Otherwise, I don't know they exist. And I can only say but so much in a PowerPoint slide. So reach out if you need any help with anything. I want you to learn. I don't want you to be tested. So let's learn. Don't stress as if it's a test. Just stress as if it's important and it's something that can empower you as an individual if you can figure out. So thank you guys. Another good week of rambling on and on and on. We're getting close to the end. These next few lectures are much more designated and, you know, more focused on what matters in our lives, not what I believe matters, but what you probably believe matters, and how you can get your government to act on it. So, thank you guys for listening. Have a good rest of your week.